mix parts trade, Deo mix Deo, not to mix parts trade, Luminix Lumine.
Hello everyone and welcome to Discussions on Meade County Catholic Radio WLHN 95.3, broadcasting from Brandyburg, Kentucky. I'm Greg Bevin. If you want a good chuckle, try telling God how to do His work. Who would have guessed that God would have called an undersized and bashful little boy from the remote town of Rhodelia, Kentucky in Meade County to be one of the best known priests in the Archdiocese of Louisville and beyond. In addition to several parish, university, and seminary assignments over his now more than 50 years of ministry, he is an accomplished author of many books, countless articles, and daily blogs on social media, mission presenter and trainer for both the lay and ordained, including deacons, priests, and even bishops, in and beyond the borders of the United States. If that's not impressive enough, his message can be absorbed without the use of some theological dictionary or Catholic encyclopedia. And his preaching is delivered as if you are the only one in the room, although you may be surrounded by hundreds. I could say more, but it is probably best that we let him tell you part of his story, and that's what we're going to do. When we return, a peek at the life and ministry of Father Ron Knott, and what it has and continues to mean to all of us.
Not to mix parts trade, Deo mix Deo, not to mix parts trade, Luminix Lumine.
50 years and counting in the priesthood, with assignments ranging from a sparsely populated Catholic community in southern Kentucky to serving as the pastor of the Cathedral of the Assumption in Louisville, not to mention the many other ministries that have touched thousands of lives in so many ways. Father Ron Knott has a unique story to tell. We want to thank the following underwriters for bringing you this short story, including Karen and Doug Stipp, Crystal and Stephen Barr, Stonegate Realty in memory of Mickey Chisholm, Mark Knott, Lois Woldrich, Nancy and Ed Tatum family, Nancy and Randy Smith, and our friends at WMMG. Now back to discussion with a short glimpse of the ongoing spiritual journey of Father Ron Knott.
Not to mix parts trade, Deo mix Deo, not to mix parts trade, Luminix Lumine.
Welcome back to Discussions, and Father Ron, I want to thank you so much today for meeting with us here and spending this time with us, and congratulations on your jubilee, your 50 years that you have served so faithfully to the church and to so many people.
Thanks, Greg. 50 years, I can't really believe it myself. I used to think old age was for other people, but being 76 now, I've done a few things to get ready for the end, just in case. I hope to live a bit longer because, God willing, I have a lot of things I want to do and places I want to go. But just in case, as the inventor of those Ronco rotisserie ovens used to say on his TV commercials, set it and forget it. So I made my end-of-life plans, but now I want to forget them and go on living. As part of those plans, I've summarized my life in 4 words that I have put on my new tombstone down in St. Teresa Cemetery. Simply amazed, forever grateful. That's pretty much how I feel about my life at 76. Looking back, I don't know how to explain it, other than God had to have led me by the hand on a surprise rambling quest from Rhodelia to all over this country and other parts of the world, and someday back to Rhodelia again. And that's why I've added at the very bottom of the tombstone 3 words home at last. I want to end up back in Meade County.
Well, Father, it would take a series of discussion shows, and I don't know how many that would take. It would be a bunch to come anywhere close to address your life and your ministry, quite honestly. So the best we can hope to do today is just kind of get a peek or a little glimpse of you as a person, and then some of the highlights of your ministry today. So if you would, talk a little bit about what formed you as a person, and when did you first recall being drawn to the religious life?
Well, as a person, I've always described myself, especially when I do priest retreats in Canada and the U.S. and around the world, I describe myself as being born and raised like a Walton. I'm John Boy, the oldest son and writer, and the first in my family to graduate from college. Rather than being from Walton's Mountain, I'm proudly from Rodelia. I was born at home, delivered by my grandmother, who baptized me right after I was born because I was in danger of death. And I grew up in my earliest years next door to Harold Vessel's store with its tiny post office inside and one gas pump. Like the Waltons, my grandfather and father had a sawmill, and they lived right across the road from us. Like the Waltons, my grandfather and father had a sawmill, and Gary and I, especially when we were kids, played in the woods most of the time during those years. When I was about 10 years old, we moved to the suburbs of Rodelia, about 100 feet away, and my dad started Knott Supply, which my brother Mark, my youngest brother, still owns and operates today. That's when the playing stopped and loading lumber, concrete blocks, and drywall started, paralleled with feeding chickens, chasing pigs, and loading cattle. I think it was during those days that I got the call to seminary. I think I was loading pigs one day when I heard God's exact words to me, something like, "Ronnie, get the hell out of Rodelia." One of the greatest influences of my life was the church and the school I attended and the people who ran them, St. Teresa Church and St. Teresa School. St. Teresa School became a public school in 1956, but the Sisters of Charity continued to be my teachers until I graduated in 1958. I can remember the day and the hour it became a public school because they went through the school and took down all the crucifixes out of the classrooms. As far as when I felt called to the priesthood was probably when I was 6 years old, believe it or not. That was the year that Father Henry Vessels from Rodelia was ordained. I never met him. He never spoke to me. He didn't even know I existed. However, he was visiting his sister, Mrs. Claudine Manning. She was married to Alvy Manning, a farmer who cut my hair for a quarter. We would always just show up unannounced, but that day he was still out at the barn milking the cows. Father Vessels, Mrs. Claudine, Father Vessels, and some of their relatives were in the kitchen playing cards. They loved to play cards. I was in the room between the kitchen and the bedroom, waiting. I noticed that Father Vessels had taken off his priest collar and laid it on the bed in the front room, the bedroom. I don't know what possessed me, but I sneaked into the bedroom, picked up his collar, put it around my neck, and tiptoed to see what I looked like in the mirror. I must have realized for the first time that day that I wanted to be a priest.
Mm-hmm. You know, you mentioned, as you recollect Rodelia, downtown and so forth. You know, even today, if we drive to Rodelia today, the topography of that community hasn't changed a lot. Still very relatively sparse, of course, and so I'm sure a lot of great memories there for you.
Yeah.
Well, Father, as you began your religious formation at a very early age, that was pretty common back at that time. You were not met with a great deal of support and promise, were you? I mean, of course, as a matter of fact, there were those who suggested that, maybe the priesthood is not God's call for you.
Well, I've all learned the hard way from observation that the worst thing you can do is to pressure young men into becoming priests. The ones whose mother always wanted their son to be a priest are the ones that never last. I was not one of those. My experience was the very opposite. At 7 years old, I was old enough to become an altar boy. Sister Mary Ancilla taught the altar boys. She taught the first and second grade for years and years. Well, after I flunked the altar boy test 3 times, remember it was in Latin back then,
Sure was.
Sister Mary Ancilla threw up her hands and said to me, and I'll never forget it, "Ronnie, you're a good kid, but I don't think you'll ever be any good around the altar." Well, I teased her about that until she died just a few years ago. Well, all during grade school, I kept the dream alive in the privacy of my own heart, didn't talk about it a lot until I got to the 7th grade. That was the year Bud Ray, also a priest from Mooleyville, and a third cousin, whose brother was married to my sister, a year older than me, mentioned on the playground, I was in the 7th grade, he was in the 8th, that there was a seminary in Louisville who took boys right out of the 8th grade. Well, all of a sudden I got very, very interested and decided to jump at the chance. In the spring of 1958, when I was about to graduate from the 8th grade, I asked my dad to take me to see Father Johnson about going to that seminary in Louisville that I had never seen or knew anything about. When I told Father Johnson what I had come for, he responded quite quickly, "No, you're too young, you need to go home and grow up first." Well, I think I started to cry at that point, and it must have moved his cold old heart a bit, because he went on to say, "Okay, I'll fill out these papers, but you won't last till Christmas." I was elated when I was accepted in the seminary. He died the year after I left for the seminary, and on his deathbed, he told my dad, "Tell Ronnie that I think he might make it."
No kidding.
Yes. Well, when I announced to the world at the Rodelia store, were a few hangers-on in that general store about the fact that I was going to the seminary. I won't mention his name because his family still lives in Meade County. They'll recognize it. But he bet $5 in front of everybody that I wouldn't last a year.
That's a big bet, wasn't it?
Yes. With all the support and encouragement behind me, I left Rodelia to begin 12 years of seminary at age 14. Well, I had no idea what I was about to get into. It was culture shock in spades. Here I was, never having been out of Rodelia more than a few hours, going to high school in Louisville. I was so confused most of the time, teased a lot about being a hillbilly and a hick, and I was always struggling to figure out what people were talking about. Nobody ever talked about loading pigs. They were talking about going to movies and restaurants and plays. Well, in my sophomore year, after limping through the first year, the head priest called me into his office and told me that he was sending me home because he considered me a hopeless case. His exact words, I still remember standing there. Well, crying helped Father Johnson, so I tried it again. It worked. He gave me another chance. You might say I cried my way all the way to the altar. I managed to somehow get through the next 4 years, and his last words to me as a sophomore in college, we were in Greek class, believe it or not. How many kids from Rodelia study Greek? When all of a sudden, his words to me were, "Knott, you've been a ball and chain around my leg for 6 years. It was sort of his good riddance speech. I'm glad he couldn't hear what I was thinking about him. But with that, I went off to St. Meinrad Seminary for 6 more years of seminary.
What a journey. What a journey. Well, eventually the naysayers did not have their way. You and God did. What was the turning point? Actually, when you knew what they didn't.
Well, I never felt secure that I would make it till I got to St. Meinrad. I love that place. The philosophy of the minor seminary in Louisville was, I call it the dental approach, was we know you've got shortcomings, cavities, sins, and failures, and we'll keep looking until we find them. Well, they never had any problem finding mine. But the philosophy of the monks at St. Meinrad was the opposite. Their philosophy was, we know you have gifts and talents, and we're going to help you identify them and help you grow them. Well, at first that scared me to death because I thought I might be the first one that arrived without having any. Well, I ended up blossoming during those years and under that philosophy. As a senior in college, I had a great conversion experience on a fire escape between classes. We used to smoke back then, and people would smoke out on the fire escape. I was still bashful, backward, and scared most of the time. I wouldn't try anything new, and certainly wouldn't do anything scary. I couldn't even read in front of my classmates. I was so bashful. On that fire escape that day, I blurted out to a good friend of mine from Indianapolis, Pat, I'm so bashful, backward, and scared, I'm going to do something about it if it kills me. Well, I was deadly serious, and I knew it down deep. I'm still working the program, still deliberately putting myself into new situations that will cause me to grow and to change. In fact, I wrote a book about it, an autobiography, story of my life, about how I'm still living out that decision that I made on the fire escape. It's entitled Between Courage and Cowardice, Choosing to Do Hard Things for Your Own Good. It was during those years that I left home for good, even for the summers. The first summer away from home, I worked in Louisville at Paramount Foods, a pickle factory. Later at St. Joseph's Infirmary, I rented an apartment, something that was unheard of for seminarians in those days. The next summer, I worked in Chicago as a house painter with a classmate of mine. The third summer, I worked for the United Church of Christ as a campground minister. I wanted to learn how to do public speaking and preaching especially. I was a desk clerk at the lodge, bartender, garbage truck driver, and MC for the Miss Crater Lake beauty pageant. Miss Garbage Truck won that year. The seminary was so impressed by my ecumenical spirit, signing up as the first Catholic seminarian to work in the Christian ministry in the national parks operated by United Church of Christ. They were so impressed that I was the only one in my class to get an A+ in pastoral theology. I don't think I was ever first in my class until that day for anything.
Well, as we will get into your ministry later, but that experience that you've just gone through, I can see where that came back to help you in one of your first assignments, which we'll get into that in just a minute. We're going to take a quick break here, and when we come back, we'll talk with you more. But, you did make it in the spring of 1970. Ronnie Knott from Rhodia, Kentucky, was ordained a priest in the Archdiocese of Louisville, and when we return, we'll visit with you as your life now becomes your ministry. The ups, the downs, the laughs, and the sorrows. A little peek of that when we return. So don't go away.
Not to make spots trade. Stay, you make stay, you. Max Portrait, Luminance Lumine.
In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 28, Jesus commissioned his original disciples, telling them, "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." Since that day, all his ordained ministers were given the same call to ministry. No one has taken it any more serious than Father Knott. Now for the second part of the story.
Nato Max Portrait, Deo Max Deo, Nato Max Portrait, Luminance Lumine.
Well, Father Ron, you're now an ordained priest. You're where many thought you would never be, and your assignments took you places you never thought you would go.
Well, when I was ordained 50 years ago, this May, I had my heart set on being assigned to a big city parish like St. James on Bardstown Road in Louisville, at best, or a small city parish like St. James in E-Town. I remember putting those two down as my first choice. By that time, I had become so urbanized that when I got the call from the bishop's office that I was going to southern Kentucky, to Somerset and its mission churches, a parish the size of the state of Delaware, I was not happy. I remember screaming over the phone, "It took me 12 years to get out of the country. I'm not ready to go back." It was home mission territory. Few Catholics, and those were sometimes hated by the local people. It was as far away from home as I could get in the diocese in those days. I tried to get them to change their minds, to no avail. Angry, I sort of threw a knot fit. I threw my stuff in the car, bought a road map, and headed south. Halfway there, I had another major conversion experience. Since I didn't get what I wanted, I decided to change my mind and want what I got. I even teach that in the seminary to other priests, young priests. If you don't get what you want, you can always want what you get by changing your mind. I decided halfway there that it was going to be a great assignment. I learned a lesson in the process. Sometimes God has a better plan than ours if we just open our hearts and minds and go with it. To this day, I always think how my life would be different if I had fought that assignment. Well, down there, I got to do campus ministry at Somerset Community College. I started a interfaith campus ministry program called IF, Interfaith. I got to take 4 backpacking trips to Europe, to the ecumenical monastery in Taizé, France. I got to have my own radio program on Sunday mornings. It's called Morning is Broken. I was able to get a doctorate degree in parish revitalization from a Presbyterian seminary in Chicago. They sent their teachers down to Lexington and Cincinnati, and we met them there. I got to be pastor of my own 2 small churches when I was only ordained 3 or 4 years. I got to give baccalaureate sermons at a public high school 3 years in a row. The seniors always got to pick who could give the baccalaureate sermon. There were no Catholics in the school.
No kidding.
I was always invited in to talk about Canterbury Tales. What were monks and nuns and priests in that famous thing. And so I got to know the senior class, and they asked me 3 years in a row to give the baccalaureate. And finally the school board had to intervene and said anybody but him. I got to do many amazing things that I would not have gotten to do if I'd gotten my way. It was a life lesson about not being overly attached to one's own preferences and points of view.
Very interesting. As a follow-up to that, Father, many people, I think, look at priests as always being welcomed with open arms, which is not always true. You've kind of alluded to that to some degree, and many also think that your ministry is always serious and maybe dull and lonely and so forth, without any light moments. Neither is the case, of course. But being the great storyteller you are, tell us some of those little short stories that touch both sides in those areas.
Well, let me address the part about not always being welcomed with open arms first. When I arrived in Monticello, I was invited to my first ministerial association meeting by a wonderful Southern Baptist minister. We were meeting across the street from his church at an independent Baptist church. They were across the street from each other, door to door. When I walked in, the host minister of the independent Baptist church walked out. I thought he was going to the bathroom or something. He sent his secretary back into the room with a note in a few minutes that read, "I can no longer in conscience be part of this group now that it has a Catholic in it. Please leave my church." The whole group was thrown out. We all got up and walked across the street to the Southern Baptist Church. I was embarrassed on one hand, but relieved on the other because the rest of the group left with me. I was often attacked by name by radio preachers. One said, "If you people had prayed hard enough, those Catholics would not have come to Wayne County." I even got an indirect message from the Klan from the neighboring county. I was scared to death sometimes to drive that coal road between McCreary and Wayne County at night, always wondering whether the road would be blocked. My own radio program was pulled off the air while I was on vacation because some minister showed up at the radio station and demanded it. I had expected it. I'd been warned, but it was not a Catholic program. It was an ecumenical program. I was showing appreciation for all the churches of Wayne County. Instead of getting upset, I just decided to kill them with kindness, which I did. Remember one thing in particular, I had connections at Play School Toy Company in Chicago, and they would send a semi-load of toys, educational toys, down to me, and I would split them up and give them to all of the Sunday schools of the churches of Wayne County every year for about 3 or 4 years. I would send a note once a week. We'd pray for a different church in the county and the success of their ministry and pastor, send them a note. And so the climate changed radically over the next 5 years by killing them with kindness. I ended up, when I left, with a front page article about my years in ministry in the local paper. I never thought I'd ever see that. As far as the funny parts, there have been many. In fact, whenever I need to tell people what I'm doing, I always write a book. I just finished a book last year. It's called I Just Had to Laugh, a music, anecdotes, humorous stories, and outrageous episodes from 50 years of priestly ministry. It's a collection of humorous and sometimes embarrassing stories from growing up days, seminary days, and from the universities, travels, various parishes, and ministries I've had over the last 50 years. One story I write about was the day I actually called the bride by the groom's old girlfriend's name at the wedding vows. Another story was about the time I almost got Archbishop Kelly killed by the police, thinking he was an intruder in the house. I have so many funny stories I've collected over the last 50 years. Some are funny, others are embarrassing, but I put most of them in the book.
I'm going to assume, Father Ronnie, that on that particular wedding boo-boo that you did, that you were not invited to the reception.
Yes, everybody laughed because everybody knew what I did. I knew the old girlfriend for years. They broke up, and I just I learned something, and you as a deacon, I would pass this on to you. Always write the names of the bride and groom in the book.
Oh, my goodness. Well, on a more serious moment, I guess, or direction, in history, and particularly in church history, one of the greatest sinners of all times became one of the greatest saints. And, of course, you certainly know that, but that was St. Augustine. And in the year 397, I think it was, he wrote a book called Confessions. And it has a section in there that says, "Is there any evil I have not committed in my deeds? Or if not deeds, then in my words. But you, Lord, are good and merciful. In your right hand plumbed the depth of my death, draining the cesspool of corruption in my heart." Father Ronnie, I think the question I wanted to present to you is, we all know that mankind and the church is no stranger to sin. And as you have lived through the tragedy of the sexual abuse and other scandals within the church, and really throughout all Christianity for that matter, how has it affected you personally? And what lesson is there in that for us?
Well, this answer might surprise people who are listening today, but in a painful way, it's been one of the good things that's happened to the church in my day. As painful as it is, it has exposed a sickness to the light of day that's been covered up for years. But that's how people dealt with embarrassing things like that years ago. I remember when I was growing up, if a girl got pregnant, she was whisked away under the cover of darkness to have her baby in another city or state. The baby was put up for adoption and returned home, where it was never mentioned again. People did what they knew how, with many such problems, like out-of-wedlock pregnancies, alcohol and drug addiction, sexual abuse, physical abuse. They hid it, denied it, and covered it up. As painful as it has helped shed some light on this epidemic, an epidemic that cuts across families, schools, civic organization, and yes, even other churches. Not only the Catholic Church. I always like to say to people, we went first. Even though we make the news more often, it is more common than people know. It has been good for children and young people to get this out in the open, and I do believe seriously that it will be good for the church in the long run. The truth will set you free.
There you go. That's right. As you meditate on your ministry to date, and your ministry's not over by any means, what areas have challenged you the most, and which parts have actually brought you the most satisfaction?
What's challenged me the most? St. Paul said this about people who make up the church. He said, "We are earthenware jars, crocks, that hold a great treasure." Biggest challenge is trying to get people to focus more on the treasure and less on the crock that holds it. Organized religion will always be in need of reform because it's made up of sinful people. But this sinful organization has brought the gospel to me and to millions of other believers over the centuries because there was a container that transferred it from one generation to the other. The great treasure will always need a crock to transport it from one generation to the next. I've always taken great comfort in the last words of Jesus when I am faced with the church's sinful side. His last words, I will be with you always, even to the end of the world. Before that, he promised that even the gates of hell shall not prevail against his church. What has brought me the most satisfaction? Preaching to the marginalized people of our world. My first experience of powerful preaching came from an experience I had in the Stephensport Baptist Church as a child. My family and I attended a funeral of a relative. You might remember, back in those days, we were basically prohibited from entering Protestant churches unless we had to go for maybe a funeral or a wedding. And if we did go, we were told not to participate. I remember sitting there, probably 7 years old, enthralled by the singable music in English and the powerful preaching, all the while remembering I was supposed not to like it. Later, the religious priests who came to our parish every few years to lead parish missions, basically a Catholic version of a Protestant revival, turned me on to extended preaching. My first preaching experience, of course, was in the United Church of Christ program I signed up for in Crater Lake National Park in 1968. I learned more about preaching from the United Church of Christ 2 years before I took preaching in the Catholic seminary. I didn't preach in a Catholic setting until 2 years later. In my years as a priest, I've always specialized in preaching to the unchurched in southern Kentucky. We didn't preach to pull people out of other churches. We preached to those who didn't belong to any church. So we preached to the unchurched. I preached to the unchurched down in the missions. In the Catholic ghetto of Marion County, which is a world opposite of the first 10 years, I did what Pope John Paul II called the new evangelization, preaching the gospel to lifetime Catholics. Then when I went to the cathedral, my preaching turned to fallen away Catholics. And during all that time, I did 70 parish missions of extended preaching, and in my 14 years of a weekly column and many published books. So preaching has always been the main thread throughout my ministry. Leading 170 priest retreats, another kind of preaching, in 10 countries. I taught preaching in the seminary. I preached to college students at Bellarmine. All of that has been my great joy. But preaching is not one style. You have to know the audience to whom you are preaching. So you have to reinvent yourself depending on the audience that's listening to you. So the unchurched, the lifetime Catholic, the fallen away Catholic, the college student who is evaluating whether they want to stay in the church, all of that is a different style of preaching. Since retirement, I'm again a missionary, just as I was in the beginning. Since retiring 5 years ago, I've been volunteering in the Caribbean missions. So foreign mission preaching is a whole different kind of preaching. I've been down there 12 times, and when this pandemic is over, I'll go back for the 13th time.
Father, you mentioned preaching, and of course you are a gifted preacher. I mentioned that in our opening dialogue. And priests in general, obviously, are gifted with the grace to minister the sacraments, especially the sacrament of the Eucharist, the sacrament of life, and the celebration of new life and funerals. And I think my question is, I know you had a special love for your mother and a little more challenging love for your father. How difficult is it to do funerals and those type of situations for all those that you love on a more personal level, especially the love of your own mom and dad?
Well, before I answer your question, I want to throw in one of the great moments of preaching for me was the parish mission I did at the Meade County Fairgrounds.
People still talk about it. You're right.
And with the gospel music and the extended preaching, that's still the musicians talk about that experience.
And as you mentioned that, and as you were going through your thoughts earlier about your nervousness or so forth, and I noticed that night for the first time that you were nervous before then. He's been around 48 years and he's still nervous, and that's what makes it a person so good.
Oh.
They put themselves on the edge so that their senses are in tune to what they're getting ready to do.
I remember talking to all of the priests of Chicago. There are I think there are 900 priests in Chicago, and I was giving a lecture, and the cardinal was sitting in the front row with 6 bishops and 900 priests. And I remember walking up the steps, and I'm saying to myself, I'm very, very nervous, saying to myself, because it was an elevated platform with TV cameras and screens all around the room. I remember saying to myself, they don't know you're from Rhodelia. They don't know you're from Rhodelia. Anyway, I love doing funerals. I'd much rather do funerals than weddings. For one thing, people don't fight you as much as they do at weddings, and you don't have to fill out a lot of paperwork, and you don't have to have rehearsals. My mother's funeral was about the value of unconditional love. My father's funeral was about the value of forgiveness. I learned something valuable from both of them, and my relationship to them always, depending on the situation, I found out that there are many people who have the same relationship I had with my mother, and probably more people that have the same relationship I had with my father.
I'm sure that's the case. Yeah.
Yes. So I guess my brother Mark's comment to me says it all. He said one day that I have my mother's heart and my father's drive. After 44 years since her death, I still tear up at Mass thinking about my mother on Mother's Day and Easter and Christmas. And after 29 years since his death, I'm still trying to prove to my dad that I'm not a failure.
One of those naysayers.
Yes.
Well, you have really bypassed the date, technically speaking, but one of the most cherished celebrations in a priest's ministry is that 50-year Golden Jubilee, which you will celebrate this year. Of course, that was planned originally this month in May, but due to this pandemic, it has been rescheduled and postponed for September. I think you're going to have one at the cathedral downtown, and as well as a big celebration in Rhodelia back in September. So I guess my final question for you today is what will be your message on those days of your official celebrations of that Jubilee?
Well, I wanted to keep it from being about me, first of all, and what I've been able to do for other people. Father Bob Ray, I've asked him to preach that day, and I told him I wanted him to focus on what God and his people have done for me and how they've formed me, sisters and brothers and parishioners and all the people I've met over the years, and how it has brought me to sum up my life, carved on my tombstone with those words, simply amazed, forever grateful. I just, every once in a while, just step back and think about growing up in Rhodelia and where all I've been, and it hasn't been about something that I created. I've said yes to opportunities, but I haven't been in charge. So I'm sort of look back at it and I'm amazed at what's happened, and I am certainly grateful to God and all the people who've been part of that.
You know, we opened up the show today, and I made the comment about if you want to make God chuckle, just tell him what to do. And as you were telling your story about that presentation among 900 of the ordained, including cardinals and all those bishops, I thought, God had to be chuckling a little bit then too. Say, hey, you guys, I think I knew what I was doing back there 50 years ago. Huh?
They don't know I'm from Rhodelia.
That's right. Yeah. Well, Father Ron, I know we've only touched a few moments of your life, and certainly the 50 years that you've served the Lord and our Savior Jesus Christ. But maybe for our listeners, and I know they'd be very, very interested in following up on a lot of your information that you have available, and maybe you can tell them how they can access more information about your ministry and the many resources available to them.
Well, being a version of John Boy Walton of Rhodelia, I'm still writing. I have a blog. I post work on it every day and post it every other day. I have many printed books available. My blog contains weekly homilies, reflections, outrageous humor, news about my volunteer work in the Caribbean missions, Rhodelia stories about growing up, you name it. I never know what's going to be on there myself. People can actually access it and sign up at the top right-hand side of the page and get it in an email every time there's a new post. It's called An Encouraging Word, same as the column in the record. And you can access it online by going to www.fatherknott.com, FATHERKNOTT, one word. There is a link over on the right-hand side called My Bookstore that lists all my books and where you can get them.
Oh, that's great.
So
that's great. You mentioned your blogs. On the weekends that I preach, I'm always anxious to get your homily, and I think, I'm going to check and see what Father Ronnie said, and I'll read it. I think, oh, man, I missed that part. So maybe if I had another 50 years of ministry, I could get closer.
Well, you need to buy the books.
Well, Father Ron, we want to certainly thank you for being our guest on Discussions this month. It's been a lot of fun, and for sharing your time with us, and more importantly, for serving the hundreds of thousands of people that you have served over the past 50 years, and for your love and your compassion and your encouragement. That's what your record article was for years and years and years, was words of encouragement and so forth. So we just want to thank you for all that you've done for those many people out there, and all the things you'll continue to do, because you're still a young man.
Well, I hope I can keep going, but I'll end up back in Rhodelia.
There you go. Yeah, eventually. But so in closing today, would you care to close us with a prayer?
May Almighty God, who loves us, cares for us, sustains us, and blesses us, bless all of those who are listening today, or those who will listen later. Bless Greg and his family. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
And God bless the Knott family.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thanks for being with us. You've been listening to Meade County Catholic Radio Talk Show Discussions. We now return to our regularly scheduled programming, now in progress.
Not to mix parts trade, stay you mix, stay you. Not to mix parts trade, lumen.